Time now for a new series of talks exploring the basic framework of Buddhist thought, the Four Noble Truths. Four leading Western Buddhist teachers each explore the meaning of one of the Four Noble Truths for a contemporary audience. I teach suffering, its origin, cessation, and path. That's all I teach, declared the Buddha 2,500 years ago. The series is introduced by Stephen Batchelor, co-founder of Sharpham College for Buddhist Studies in Devon. In this opening talk, he explains the idea behind the first truth, the truth of suffering.
We live in an unstable world. By the time I reach the end of this sentence, the Milky Way will have traveled 120 miles closer to the center of its galaxy cluster, the Earth 20 miles in its orbit around the Sun, while your brain will have generated millions of firing patterns. We inhabit a universe of relentless motion and flux, in which everything from an idle thought to a solar system comes into being, then hastens to its end. While this way of seeing things might induce a sense of religious awe, it can also send a chill of terror through one. One is unsettled by the sheer groundlessness and vastness of nature's unfolding. What can I depend on here? What can I trust? This way of looking at human existence illustrates what Buddhists call the suffering of change. The instability and contingency of things provoke a brooding disquiet that hovers in the background of our lives. We know that our presence on this earth is not as secure as we would like it to be, but we tend to ignore this fact and lose ourselves in the more pressing issues at hand. Paradoxically, though, to confront such inescapable truths may turn out to enrich our existence rather than undermine it. I did not choose to be here, but now I cannot accept the thought of not being here. However certain I feel about the necessity of my existence, the only certainty I face is that this seemingly necessary being will perish. This heart will cease pumping blood, these lungs will cease drawing air, these neurons will cease firing in my brain. My body will rot or be consumed by fire, and within a matter of years I will linger on only as a memory in the fading minds of those who once knew me. This is a place where things happen that we don't want to happen. Cars skid on ice and swerve off roads into trees instead of reaching their destination. Your rival wins the hand of the person you love. Floods and earthquakes destroy in moments what years of labor have created. At times I feel hemmed in, inwardly subjected to the vagaries of a fragile body and fickle mind, outwardly overwhelmed by the demands of a suffering world. A contradictoriness penetrates to the very core of what I feel to be my true and independent self. I yearn to be free of pain, wrote the 8th century Indian Buddhist monk Shantideva, but rush straight into it. I long for happiness, but trample on it. This observation is disquieting. Shantideva is not talking about an occasional moral lapse that could be corrected by fear of punishment or a timely boost of righteousness. He is pointing to a conflict that seems knit into the very fabric of our existence. According to legend, Siddhartha Gautama, the prince who was to become Buddha, was raised in palaces where his attention was constantly diverted from the contingency, transience, and unreliability of his existence. Then one day he made the mistake of asking his father to let him see the world outside the palace walls. Despite the king's efforts to ensure that no distressing sights would spoil the young man's enjoyment, Siddhartha chanced upon a person crippled with age, another ridden with disease, and a corpse. For the first time he was struck by the impermanent, finite, and tragic nature of human life. He realized that once born on this earth, one will inevitably age, fall ill, suffer accidents, and die. A privileged upbringing in a prosperous 21st century society bears striking parallels to that of Prince Siddhartha in North India 500 years before Christ. Our attention, too, is constantly diverted, this time by a bombardment of information that keeps the desires and fears that hold us captive in a constant state of agitation. We each aspire to a virtual palace that promises the fulfillment of our longings and the elimination of our pain. Sickness, aging, and death are likewise concealed from us. Whether hidden away inside hospitals, homes, and morgues, or obscured by cosmetic surgery or an undertaker's art, ill, decrepit, and dead bodies are kept out of sight. While we might ruefully reflect from time to time on this web of deceptions that surrounds us, it is rarely enough to prompt a radical change in how we live. But this is the effect it had on Siddhartha Gautama. The contradiction between his pursuit of pleasure and power and his awareness of the contingency, transience, and anguish of life became intolerable for the young man. These uncensored glimpses of existence startled and perplexed him. Rather than regarding his life as a compilation of more or less interesting facts, it became a pressing question for him. No longer could he rely on his common-sense convictions to justify his existence on this earth. For the certainty of being Siddhartha Gautama, son of King Shuddhodana and heir to the throne, was a hopelessly inadequate answer to the question posed by the sheer fact of being born and having to die. To stay with this question rather than getting diverted again by the more manageable problems of daily existence is almost impossibly demanding. A Zen Buddhist meditation manual asks that one pose this question through the pores of one's skin and with the marrow of one's bones. Siddhartha's perplexity was not a philosophical or religious curiosity. It gripped him in such a way that nothing else seemed to matter until he had resolved it. When he returned to his palaces, he felt, in the words of his Sanskrit biographer Ashvaghosha, like a lion pierced deeply in the heart by an arrow. Late one night, when his courtiers and courtesans were asleep, he slipped away into the surrounding forest, discarded his royal garb, and assumed the life of a wandering ascetic. 6 years later, after much effort and disappointment, in what seems like a final act of desperation, he vowed to sit beneath a tree and not stand up again until he had resolved his dilemma. 7 days later, he experienced an awakening, often translated as enlightenment, that at last provided an adequate response to the question posed by the riddle of birth, sickness, aging, and death. He thus came to be known as Buddha, which simply means awakened one. For the next 40 years, he taught his followers how to reach awakening through cultivating a middle way of ethical integrity, meditative stillness, and penetrating inquiry. This awakening was not, however, a shattering mystical revelation of the truth with a capital T. When asked what he had understood, Gautama would characteristically reply, suffering and the cessation of suffering. His awakening entailed coming to terms with a complex of 4 interrelated truths: suffering, its origins, its cessation, and the path that leads to that cessation. It was not until I grasped these 4 truths, declared Gautama, that I could consider myself fully awake. These truths revealed to him both the nature of the human dilemma as well as the possibility of its resolution. As a response to the questions raised by the contingency, transience, and painfulness of life, his awakening illuminated the nature of suffering as vividly as it did the way to resolve it. The path that brings such anguish to an end, he discovered, starts by gazing unflinchingly into the heart of suffering itself. Rather than a set of propositions in which to believe, Buddha presented these 4 truths as injunctions upon which to act. Each truth demands its own corresponding response. For example, suffering, the first truth, demands to be fully known. Rather than spending our lives trying to avoid and ignore the underlying instability and unease of our condition, Buddha suggests instead that one calmly focus attention on this aspect of existence in a sustained and reflective manner. In this way, we begin to shift attention away from an obsession with self and contemplate instead the fluctuating matrix of contingencies from which this play of me and mine continuously emerges and vanishes. Common sense suggests that meditating on the transience of life would only make one morbid and depressed. In contrast, Buddha compared sickness, aging, and death to divine messengers that open our eyes to truths that can liberate us from anguish. Our lives become flat and depressed, he maintained, because we refuse to heed their message and remain stubbornly committed to sustaining the fiction of being permanent and necessary. By accepting our mortality and contingency, though, we may find ourselves infused by the sheer, exuberant astonishment of being alive now, in this moment. Understanding and embracing our condition in this way is the first step towards releasing the attachment we have to being a fixed, unchanging ego. This process of coming to terms with existential unease is comparable to following a course of medical treatment. Buddha referred to himself as a healer and his teachings as a course of treatment. What he taught was intended to be therapeutic rather than consoling. He wanted people to apply his teachings in a way that made a difference to their lives. The path he described offered no miracles. It was up to each person to work out their own salvation with diligence. To illustrate his approach, Buddha told the story of a man who is seriously wounded by an arrow, but says to his friends, "I will not let the surgeon pull out the arrow until I know the name and clan of the man who shot it, whether his bow was a longbow or a crossbow, whether the arrow was hoof-tipped, curved, or barbed." This absurdly inappropriate demand is, however, no different from someone else saying, "I will not follow the path until Buddha declares to me whether the world is finite or infinite, whether the soul is the same as or different from the body, whether an awakened one continues or ceases to exist after death." The pursuit of such metaphysical questions is just a high-minded distraction from the more pressing issue of confronting the dilemma of one's existence here and now. It really doesn't matter who shot the arrow or how it got there. The crucial thing is to recognize that it is there. We might then realize that a great deal of our suffering stems from a tight existential grip embedded like an arrow in the core of ourselves. This grip is so intimately familiar that for most of the time we fail to notice it. It holds us in a kind of spasm that solidifies our experience in such a way that everything, including ourselves, appears inert, opaque, and lifeless. Only after a close shave in a car accident, or when a friend is diagnosed with a terminal disease, do we feel its cold, implacable constriction. The task, however, is to find a way to release this grip, thereby removing the arrow. And that, for Buddhists, is called nirvana.
Stephen Batchelor on the first of the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. The producer was Anthony Denslow. Next week at the same time, Robert will discuss the second noble truth, the truth of the cause of suffering.
The third in a series of talks exploring the basic framework of Buddhist thought, the Four Noble Truths. Christina Feldman is a writer and founder of Gaia House, the meditation and Buddhist studies centre in Devon. She talks about cessation of suffering.
The essence of Buddhist teaching can be described in a simple statement. I teach just one thing. There is suffering and there is an end to suffering. The cessation of suffering is the third noble truth and lies at the heart of all Buddhist practice and teaching. The third noble truth is inextricably linked to the first two noble truths. There is unsatisfactoriness in life and there is a cause of suffering. All the varieties and dimensions of pain and unsatisfactoriness we can experience in this life are not independently arisen, but can with wisdom and clarity be traced back to the roots of ignorance and craving. When the cause of suffering is penetrated and dissolved with wisdom, we can discover a way of being in this world and in ourselves in which suffering ends. More than 2,500 years ago, the young Prince Siddhartha sat down beneath a Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, India, with the resolve to remain unmoving until he understood the nature of genuine freedom. Throughout the night, he was besieged by the forces of Mara or illusion, in the guises of lust, anger, fear, craving, and doubt. The prince remained still and unshakable, facing Mara without flinching, able to say simply, "I know you." As the night went on, Siddhartha's meditation deepened, and he began to understand the nature of suffering, the cause of suffering, freedom from suffering, and the path to the end of suffering. When he rose in the morning from his night of meditation, he said, "My liberation is unshakable. I have done what needs to be done." Throughout his life, the Buddha described his enlightenment as the understanding of the deathless, as unconditioned, timeless, the highest peace and happiness, the end of all suffering, and as Nibbana. The volumes of words written about Nibbana are only signposts, directing us to deeply understand the nature of ourselves and our life. Awakening for each of us is a profoundly intuitive path that asks us to dive deeply into our own hearts and minds, to see for ourselves where suffering is, how it's caused, and to see its end experientially. No one can substitute for us on this journey. All the knowledge or opinions we can gather about awakening will not bring suffering to an end. In discovering for ourselves a profound freedom of heart and mind, through letting go of the causes of suffering, we're liberated, and our understanding is unshakable. Siddhartha's experience beneath the Bodhi tree was not the first of his awakenings. In his life as a prince, sheltered from the storms of life in his palace, he'd come to understand that none of his wealth, possessions, or the spectrum of pleasure and distraction that filled his life could protect him from the realities of change, aging, sickness, and death. It was this first profound realization that motivated him to enter a homeless life. He understood that genuine liberation, peace, and wisdom lay within his own heart, and not, as he'd previously believed, within the multiplicity of events and things he could gain or possess. The Third Noble Truth is a teaching that's continued to inspire the spiritual journeys of countless people over the centuries. As human beings, we long to be free, to find the end of pain and discover an abiding peace and balance. The Third Noble Truth affirms that this is a genuine possibility for all of us. The Buddha taught that the causes of sorrow and the causes of joy lie within our own hearts. Suffering, the Buddha taught, is not a life sentence or a terminal condition. Its continuation relies upon the continuation of ignorance and craving. Its end comes with the cessation of ignorance and craving. Underlying all the debates and arguments about the nature of liberation, there are several key elements of agreement. The Buddha stressed repeatedly that freedom is not reserved for a fortunate minority of people who have the appropriate portfolio of spiritual achievements. Liberation, he emphasized, is available for anyone willing to commit themselves wholeheartedly to cultivating goodness of heart and depth of understanding. We can all learn to let go in this life. We can all cultivate the honesty, integrity, and dedication that makes us more enlightenment-prone rather than prone to confusion and suffering. We can learn to be awake in our lives, present and curious to the moment-to-moment arising and passing of suffering. Too often we're so involved in trying to escape from pain, struggle, and anguish that it doesn't occur to us that it might be a good idea to stop running. Our willingness to be present with curiosity, commitment, and calmness in all the moments of our life is the first step on the path of liberation and understanding the cessation of suffering. Integral to the Buddhist teaching of freedom is the emphasis upon immediacy. Enlightenment's not some distant goal. It's realization to be postponed until we have the ideal life and accomplishments. Time is not intrinsically a factor in awakening. In teaching the path of awareness, the Buddha instructed that this is a direct path for the surmounting of lamentation and sorrow, for the disappearance of pain and grief, for the realization of nibbana. Another key element in the discovery of liberation is the enduring encouragement of the Buddha to turn towards our life, to discover the freedom we seek for. It's not a teaching of transcendence that demands that we divorce ourselves from the world, nor is liberation described as some separate dimension. In everything he taught, the Buddha invited us to embrace our bodies, hearts, and minds with mindfulness and investigation. It is here we discover unshakable liberation, the liberation of our hearts through loving kindness, the liberation of our minds through wisdom. Contemplating the nature of our bodies, minds, and hearts, we contemplate the nature of all life. Within our life, we see the truths of change, of suffering, its cause, and the absence of any enduring sense of self. The implications of this understanding are profound. Within the unalterable waves of change, we can never find any enduring refuge or freedom. Much of the suffering in our life is optional, born of grasping, clinging, and the demand that life conforms to our desires. Seeing the absence of any enduring center of self is an understanding that has the power to liberate us from fear, from self-protection, and to see the transparency of all the painful divisions that live between self and other. Nibbana is the cessation of clinging, craving, and ignorance. It doesn't equate with annihilation. Liberation's not a device to make life go away, nor will it guarantee that we will then have a continuum of only pleasant sensations, experiences, thoughts, and feelings. The Buddha's enlightenment, it didn't exempt him from an aging body, illness, and death. It did allow him to meet all of life's adversity, challenge, and unpredictability with equanimity, compassion, and balance. It is a cessation of clinging, demand, and attachment, born of understanding, that allows us to embrace all the moments of our life with poise, fearlessness, and care. Enlightenment's not the same as not caring. It's not clinging. There are moments in all of our lives when we catch a glimpse, no matter how fleeting, of the deep freedom that is the nature of letting go. We emerge from bouts of obsession or anxiety, letting go of the thoughts and fears that have gripped us, and we feel ourselves emerging into a sense of freedom. We open a clenched fist, breathe out after moments of holding our breath, feel able to relinquish some demand or goal that has consumed us. In all of these moments, we have a taste of freedom. At times, the Buddha described enlightenment as awakening from a dream. It's a dream born of ignorance. Ignorance in Buddhist teaching is not a personal insult or intended to imply an absence of knowledge. It's the ignorance of not understanding the way things actually are. Through contemplating our life on a moment-to-moment level, we are learning to penetrate the veils of ignorance that can create so much unnecessary sorrow. The Buddha defined ignorance in a number of ways. Mistaking pleasure for genuine happiness, we can spend our lives prowling the world in pursuit of a succession of pleasant sensations, events, and experiences. We can be equally intent on avoiding the unpleasant. We can feel so gratified and bolstered by the pleasant, and equally threatened by and fearful of the unpleasant. It's the birthplace of craving and aversion. No matter how successful we are in avoiding the unpleasant and attaining the pleasant, somehow the quest for enduring happiness remains unsatisfied. Craving's an unquenchable thirst, and one of the building blocks of pain. We try to hold on to and maintain what we cherish, want, and depend upon. Yet we see that none of our clinging prevents the crumbling of everything that arises. It really only takes a few moments of contemplation for us to see experientially that everything that arises in this life will also pass. For every birth there is a death. Impermanence is a simple but profound truth from which nothing in this world, including ourselves, is exempt. Ignorance is a denial of this reality. We seek the unchanging within the changing, the eternal within the ephemeral, the constant within the fluid, And so we struggle and suffer. We think that we suffer because of change. In truth, we suffer because of our refusal to embrace the truth of change. Demanding that life stand still for us, trying to grasp the ungraspable, and demanding immortality within the mortal, is a recipe for endless, unnecessary pain. The implications of deeply embracing the reality of change are that we learn to let go more freely and fully in this life. It's an act of compassion for ourselves. We are letting go of ignorance and suffering. We can go through life living within a constructed illusion of being an independent, unchanging self, living within a world of equally independent selves, separate and apart from us. We can feel so confined and limited by this illusion, yet it's also one we fiercely protect. As we contemplate our sense of self, we see that it's constructed essentially of everything we grasp hold of. If we were invited to write a short autobiography, each sentence beginning with the words, "I am," what we most dearly grasp hold of would be revealed to us. We identify with our bodies, our emotions, our perceptions, states of mind, our opinions, our gender and race. Some of this identification has a long history, some of it born on a moment-to-moment level. We see that each moment we grasp hold of a thought, a feeling, a body sensation, our personal story of the moment is born, and with it born the limitation and confinement of that story. As we explore this sense of self more closely, we also see that it changes according to the grasping of the moment. Our sense of self in the midst of sadness may be so radically different than how we would describe ourselves in the midst of exhilaration. With mindfulness and equanimity, the tendency to grasp hold of anything at all within the changing world of experience is released. So too is the suffering born of grasping. The cessation of ignorance is a cessation of suffering, separation, and struggle. It's the liberation of the heart and mind, the highest happiness and peace, the unshakable refuge, and the birthplace of compassion.
Christina Feldman on the third of the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. The producer was Anthony Denslow.
To Radio 4, where now it's time for the last in the series of talks exploring the basic framework of Buddhist thought, the Four Noble Truths. 2,500 years ago, the Buddha declared, "I teach suffering, its origin, cessation, and path. That's all I teach." Well, Ajahn Sukhito is a British Buddhist monk who trained in Thailand and who's now the abbot of Chithurst Monastery in Sussex. He describes the path to the cessation of suffering.
What if, by contemplating your own thoughts, actions and feelings, and by noticing their causes and effects, you could establish ease and confidence in life? What if, without belief, supposition or ideology, you could find out how you get stressed and frustrated and put an end to all that? At any rate, since you're living your life, you might as well pay attention to it. So why not fully awaken to what's happening in and around you? In exploring these possibilities, millions of people throughout the world use the teachings of the Buddha. Some shy away from calling themselves Buddhists, feeling that such a label might compromise the authenticity of their inquiry. From a Buddhist point of view, there is no problem with this. The main point is to listen to the Buddha's teachings, mull them over, put them into practice, and feel out the results. The teachings, called the Dhamma, are likened to medicine, and everyone who practices Dhamma can choose the medicine that they need in accordance with the nature of the problem that needs curing. But the general theme that covers all Dhamma teachings is they are aspects of the Four Noble Truths of dukkha, or suffering, its origin, its ceasing, and the path which leads to the end of suffering. This is called the Noble Eightfold Path. The 8 factors of this eightfold path are right view, right intent, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. I'll give details on these factors later. But the first, the most important point, is they're a way of living. They're not philosophical concepts, beliefs, or descriptions of an ultimate truth or divinity. They lead to an awakening to ultimate truth, but do not define it. The Buddha's realization was that the experience of ultimate truth was consonant with the ending of dukkha. And dukkha, whether this be depression, anxiety, frustration, or a more general sense of pointlessness, concerns us all in the here and now of our lives. It's not a matter of belief. Nor in Buddhism do you have to believe that there is such a thing as liberation or ultimate truth. Just put an end to suffering and stress, and you'll know truth for yourself. So the Buddhist approach is through direct experience, of which the first thing to consider is where both our innermost pain and a most reliable sense of well-being are to be found. Circumstances such as illness or good fortune come and go, but what lingers with us are internal conditions, a sense of being trusted and at peace, or of having regret or hatred gnawing away at our hearts. If we have peace of mind, we can weather through the rough patches, but guilt, hatred or depression can cloud the brightest day. A millionaire or a king can be beset with worry and mistrust, and a penniless monk, like the Buddha, can dwell in ease and fulfillment. Suffering and cessation lie in our minds and hearts. Mind and heart, we have an awareness that's affected by it and responds to experience. This awareness is what the Buddha would encourage a listener to attend to when putting the teachings to the test. In dialogue, he would encourage the inquiry, how does it feel if someone abuses you, kills your friends and relatives? Is that suffering or not? And how is it when people treat you with generosity and kindness? And if you act in either of these ways, which brings about the results that will give you most well-being? So using your own wisdom, how should you best act? Applying reasoned inquiry in this way, the Buddha would sketch in the outline of his Dhamma. However, for myself, as for many people, Buddhism began with meditation. I had graduated from university, had a head full of ideas, and just as many questions as to what life was about. But before following any particular career, it seemed best to get my own take on what I really wanted. I eventually arrived in Thailand and happened across a class in Buddhist meditation being given in English. The venue was a room in a Buddhist monastery that had a few mats to sit on and nothing much else. It was lit by a lamp which was placed next to the meditation teacher, who was sitting up front beside a window. He was a Westerner and was wearing the ochre-brown robes of a Buddhist monk. Being a monastery in the tropics, there was no glass in the window, and flying ants were coming, attracted to the light. A few fluttered over the monk, but I noticed that as he spoke, he wasn't put off by the ants moving over his arms, and just occasionally picked one carefully off his face. It seemed to be in danger of going into his mouth. He wasn't getting agitated, and he picked each ant off with specific awareness of its fragility, without losing the thread of what he was talking about. In the same situation, I'd have killed a few ants, got irritated about the lack of glass, and definitely lost the gist of what I was talking about. But the stress that I'd got into would have been self-induced. The ants weren't actually doing any harm. It was more a matter of responding to the sensation with full awareness rather than reacting to it, which was a good introduction to what meditation was about, and in a larger sense, to what the Buddhist path was all about. In a nutshell, the Eightfold Path can be seen as covering ethics, meditation, and understanding. In the class in Thailand, that meant don't kill flying ants, be with what's happening, and guide your responses with an understanding of how to let go of the stress. Easy enough in theory, but I could see I needed some training. Meditation takes us to where we're really being affected, for that's where we tend to react blindly. To respond clearly to experience, we need to establish guidelines. The foundation for such guidelines is right view. Right view is the recognition that what we do counts. We're not in a predetermined cosmos. We can be effective. We can be a source of benefit or harm for ourselves and others, and such a responsibility is not so much a moral obligation as a mandate. If we develop clarity and kindness, we can live with that kind of mind. If, however, we sustain prejudices or indifference, we become narrow and insensitive. We can act clearly and be at peace with ourselves, or we can act out of compulsion and get stuck. because compulsion leads to addictive behaviour and loss of personal authority. And in all cases, the chances are that we'll end up being associated with people who mirror our attitudes. So right view is the recognition that our own integrity has to be the centre of our lives. And that feels empowering. Right intent, sometimes called right thought, proceeds from an understanding of cause and effect. It means setting up the intention to bring around skillful results through body, speech and mind, and to relinquish the unskillful ones. This is the foundation of the teachings on action, or karma as it's called in Buddhism, of which mental intention is the agent. Since actions of body and speech proceed from mind states and emotions, if we can get the mind and heart clear, we can both act from a place of balance and be able to discern the results of our actions. This is the case with right speech and right action. We give up stealing, deception and violence and cultivate honesty and words that are worth treasuring. Right livelihood means avoiding trade in arms, prostitution, animal slaughter, and it also broadens out into how one shares one's life with others. Our relationships with other people profoundly influence our minds. So on occasion the Buddha gave attention to husband-wife relationships, parenting, mutually supportive norms for employer and employee, as well as on the benefits and qualities of friendship. Right view, right effort and right mindfulness underlie every other factor. For example, with right speech one starts with right view by recognizing that how one talk affects others. We can bring something of value into someone's mind with a well-attuned remark, or we can ruin their day. We could be left with regret and mistrust, or with openness and peace of mind. From there, right effort means doing the work of steering one's actions, while right mindfulness entails being fully there with what we do or say and what effects it has. And the result of all this is we avoid distress and participate in something of immediate benefit. This is the process of the entire Eightfold Path. Mindfulness and the last path factor, right concentration, take us into the domain of meditation, the cultivation of awareness. These factors are often what people are struck by in Buddhism because they offer a powerful deepening of the inner life, possibilities of great serenity and joy, and the unconditioned peace that is called Nibbana. And this deepening begins and is maintained with mindfulness, which entails being simply and purely present to what is going on. If I go back to that first meditation class in Thailand, the monk gave us some advice on how to sit upright in a state of relaxed alertness and start paying attention to the sensations that accompanied the process of breathing. I couldn't have followed more than a breath or two before my mind was wandering. In fact, it was careening on a wave of speculations, memories and analyses. Every now and then I would steer my attention back to the breath sensations and be able to maintain that for a few seconds before a fresh tide of thoughts came washing in. This is pretty much the standard beginner's meditation. Nevertheless, what struck me deeply was that here I was witnessing my mind. And that was strangely peaceful, even reassuring. Somehow I didn't have to make anything out of my thoughts, or even out of my mind. It was just something happening. Moreover, if I was witnessing my mind, who was I? And whose mind was this? The Buddha reckoned these to be unanswerable questions. Whatever you think or say you are, that is just one more event passing through your mind. No, the point is that there is always this present awareness, and what passes through it is changing and not what you really are. But the more you centre on that present awareness, maybe using a focal point like the sensations of breathing to help you do that, the steadier and clearer you feel. You can let go of the impulses and sensations that come up, or, as I learnt later, you can focus on them and allow the steadiness of awareness to bring them into harmony, which is what happens. That is, with practice you can stop struggling with your body and your moods, and that very quality of non-struggle starts to infuse and settle them. So, bringing attention to the present is mindfulness, and the result, a steadiness that pervades the body and mind, is concentration or samadhi. Samadhi is not a concentration that you do, it's a centered and pleasurable unity that occurs as a result of right view, right effort, and right mindfulness. Although the practice of mindfulness and concentration is immensely remedial in terms of clearing out stress, worry, and obsessive moods, it has a further development, which is the understanding that liberates the practitioner from the very source of suffering and stress. This understanding, called insight, both attunes you to the ephemeral nature of what is happening and puts you in touch with the steady ever-presence of awareness itself. Sensing this time and time again, an involuntary shift takes place. Your center moves to that pure awareness. In daily life you can act from that awareness with compassion and clarity, and in meditation you can let all the events subside and dwell in a bright, unhindered presence. This leads to Nibbana, the fulfillment of the Eightfold Path. As you get to sense this, even in glimpses, you don't get caught up in hankering or dejection. There's no frustration, no need to defend, and nothing you have to prove. Just this is an end to suffering and stress. For me personally, this is the best option that human life affords. But as the Buddha recommended, it's up to each of us to know it for ourselves.
Ajahn Sukhito on the last of the Four Noble Truths, the path to the cessation of suffering. And if you'd like to hear the four talks again, you can find them on the BBC Radio 4 website. The series was produced by Anthony Denislow.